After the chapter 38 interlude of Judah and Tamar that tells us why Jacob's family needed to be removed for a season from the growing corruption of Canaan, the story returns in chapter 39 to Joseph's story, which began in chapter 37. Joseph went to Egypt first. Years later, the entire family would join him there. And here's how it happened. Joseph's brothers, jealous because he was Pop's favorite, sold him to slavers who took him to Egypt. We read in verse 1 of chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Potiphar was a well-placed official in Pharaoh's royal guard. Since Egypt was a premier power, if not the premier power in the ancient world of that time, that's the 19th century BC, of course, Potiphar enjoyed a position of great power and influence. He would have a large estate and many servants. He was able to buy another and saw in Joseph a good buy. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. 3 words give us the key to Joseph's success. In verse 4 it says that, and he served him. It would have been easy for Joseph to be bitter at going from a position of privilege back home in Canaan to a slave in some foreigner's house. Most people, given the same circumstance, would be angry at God or sunk into depression. But not Joseph, because he held on to a truth that all of us need to hold on to. We don't know when it happened, but at some point in this young man's life, Joseph was faced with the choice to believe in the goodness of God or not. I want to suggest that it was after his brothers sold him to the Ishmaelite traders, probably as they were making their way towards Egypt. Joseph had days to think about what had happened, but even more importantly, why. Just like you and I, when we're plunged into a major trial, surely Joseph began to question God's will. He came face to face with this question. Either the God that he had heard about all of his life was real, or he wasn't. And if God was real, Joseph needed to believe the whole package that he'd heard about him. That he's all powerful, that he's good, that he's in control. Though Joseph didn't understand what was going on, he understood that he ought to trust God to work it out. Faith means holding on in the dark, confident that a glorious dawn will come. I believe that Joseph came to that place on that trip to Egypt, so that when he arrived in Potiphar's house in the role of a slave, he faithfully did the tasks that were assigned to him. He served the God he could not see by serving someone he could. And in proof that this was the right decision, God blessed him. Everything he did just worked. It didn't take long for Potiphar to recognize that he had great skill, promoted him as chief steward over his entire estate. A lot of lessons there for the followers of Jesus that I trust the Holy Spirit is even now imparting to you. Well, verse 5. And so it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. As soon as Joseph became Potiphar's chief steward, his entire estate was blessed. Now, verse 5 makes it clear that Potiphar prospered by God's blessing of Joseph. While the world hates God and abuses those who follow him, much of the blessing that it receives is due to God's favor on his people. Jesus said that as we follow him, we are the salt and light of the world. The world would be much worse off were it not for the blessing that believers bring. Halfway through verse 6, the story turns, as all great tales do. We read, now Joseph was handsome in form and face. Well, this kid's got it all. He's spiritually mature, he's successful in business, he's risen to a place of authority in a powerful man's home, and now we learn that he could grace the cover of Egyptian Quarterly. But even on the best day, he's still a slave, something that Mrs. Potiphar, well, she's going to take advantage of, verse 7. And it came to pass after these things, let's just pause right there, time has passed. Joseph's risen to his position as chief steward and become a confidant of the powerful Potiphar. In chapter 37, we're told that Joseph was 17 when all this began. He's probably right around 19 or 20 at this point. Keep that in mind as we read on. Again, verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. As chief steward, Joseph would have been in daily and close contact with Mrs. Potiphar. Being young, handsome, skilled, well, she was attracted to him and made it clear that she wanted to hook up. We need a little background here. According to the customs and culture, what she proposed wasn't unusual. Slaves were property to be used, and used they were. The Greek philosopher Plato expressed the attitude of the ancient world towards slaves when he said that they were merely living tools, objects. Mrs. Potiphar was allowed a lot of both legal and moral latitude in how she chose to use her servants, and Joseph knew that. So what will his reaction be to her invitation? What will this fine specimen of a young man's response be to the most likely attractive Mrs. Potiphar? Now, how can I say that she was attractive, since there's nothing in the text to suggest it? Well, have you seen the wives of rich and powerful men? Even the ugly ones have attractive wives because of their power, their wealth, their celebrity. Assuming Mrs. Potiphar is a babe, it's probably no stretch. Joseph's far from home, far from family. He's young, single, and though a slave, has real power and authority. The culture and customs allow him to hook up with her. Heck, even more than allow, it's expected because it would secure his role in the house even more tightly, while refusing her could result in all kinds of trouble. You know what they say, hell hath no fury as a woman scorned. Verse 8, but he refused and said to his master's wife. Let's just pause there again. Joseph didn't turn her down and so leave her with the thought that it was because he found her repulsive. He gives her perfectly good reason for not warming her bed. He says, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Though custom allowed her to proposition Joseph, he knew that it was something her husband would not approve of. She would be cheating on her husband and Joseph wouldn't betray him. His response is instructive. First, note how polite his resistance is to her offer. He didn't get all morally superior, though he certainly was. He didn't arrogantly shame her for her attempted seduction. Joseph is like Jesus in this regard. Sinners were attracted to Jesus because his holiness was humble, not haughty. Jesus saw what sinners could become through his truth and grace and held forth the hope of new life. Listen, if your workmates invite you to happy hour, you don't need to screw up your face in disgust saying that while they're sucking down the devil's juice, you're going to go to Bible study. By all means, go to study instead of happy hour. But tell them to be careful and that one day, maybe invite them to study with you before they head off to down Manhattans and Cosmos and Old Fashions. A second, Joseph was prepared for this. He had a response already when Mrs. Potiphar started her seductions. He was a sharp guy. He had seen the hungry looks that she'd been giving him. He knew that it was just a matter of time until she invited him to her bed. And so he'd already worked out what he'd say when it happened. When she said, lie with me, he whips out his list and ticks them off. Well, it's a betrayal of her husband's trust. It's adultery, which is morally wrong. And most important of all, it would be a sin against God. Hey, let's learn from Joe's example here. Are you going to be tempted? Yes. And while we don't know all of the ways that we're going to be tempted, there are lots of ways we can assume we will be. We all know what our weaknesses are. So decide ahead of time how you're going to deal with temptation. Have a plan. Don't wait till you're in the grip of it to figure out what you're going to do, what you're going to say. You know, that man or woman at work whose marriage is a mess and has been asking you for counsel may suggest that you meet up after work. Well, what are you going to say? When the cashier gives you change for 20 rather than the 5 that you gave, what are you going to do? When your boss tells you to fudge some numbers on a report, what will you say? Planning our response to temptation is a key strategy in spiritual warfare. Now, so far, we've seen Joseph was polite, he was prepared. And third, most importantly, consider Joseph's priority. He was totally committed to God. He knew that to yield to her would be a sin against the Lord, a compromise of his commitment. He'd come to his total commitment to God on his way to Egypt before even arriving in Potiphar's house. And that commitment had freed him from anger and resentment toward his brothers. They hadn't sent him to Egypt. God had. Joseph's commitment to God delivered him from the soul-crushing bitterness of going from favored son to lowly slave. It empowered him to serve his master because he saw it as service of God. And his commitment gave him the resolve to resist Mrs. Potiphar's seduction because although no one else might know, God saw and would mark it as wrong. What a great example Joseph is. His example becomes even more inspiring as we read on. Verse 10, and so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her or be with her. You see, she didn't just attempt to seduce him once. It went on day after day. And when it says that he did not heed her to lie or be with her, it means that he never even entertained the temptation. And really, that's a good way to phrase it. Entertaining a temptation. You know, we welcome it in. We allow it to play out in our minds, fantasize, spend energy and effort imagining it, like a movie we see on the back of our eyelids. Friend, be careful that the movies your mind creates don't poison your soul and stir up desires that your flesh craves. Don't write mental checks your soul can't cash without going bankrupt. Joseph was committed to God, and that commitment drew a fence around his life that he would not tear down for anything. It didn't matter what his circumstances were. He was God's man. He'd surrendered himself to God's keeping. What God chose to do with him was up to God. Joseph's duty was simple: stay faithful. Though it wouldn't be written until almost 2,000 years later, Joseph lived by the principle that the Apostle Paul spells out in Colossians 3:17. Where we find this: whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Though Joseph has already suffered greatly at the hands of his own family, selling him into slavery, things are going to get even worse for him. Through it all, his faith remained true, his commitment to God uncompromised. While Joseph is a standout in the trusting God department, the reality is there's no reason we can't be as well. He didn't know something we can't. He just decided to really believe and act as though the all-powerful, all-wise God is also all good and worthy of trust. How are things any different for us? Really, they aren't. Well, let's see what happens as we carry on with Joseph's tale. So Mrs. Potiphar was used to having things her way, saw Joseph's resolve and commitment to God as a thing to overcome. His resistance really only made him more attractive to her. Her desire grew. She became more brazen and bold in her seduction. It all came to a head one day, verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened, when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." Mrs. Potiphar decided to take the direct approach with Joseph. One day, when it was just the two of them alone in the house, the implication being that she had sent the other servants away, she took hold of Joseph and demanded that he have sex with her. If discovery or modesty was bothering him, she made it easy for him to yield to her. Anything that might have stood in the way of Joseph's surrender to her was removed. In her mind, there was now no reason for him not to lie with her. But in Joseph's heart, though no human was present to see, God was watching. And his commitment to the Lord meant that he could not give in to this woman, no matter how appealing the offer might be. Okay, let's be honest. Few men could or would resist the temptation. The only ones who would are those who are committed to God. They live coram Deo, a Latin phrase that means before God's face. The morality that shapes our choices isn't situational. It's shaped by what pleases the God who is always present, always sees. The committed live their lives for God's approval. For Joseph, though Mrs. Potiphar had removed all obstacles, nothing had changed because God hadn't. From her perspective, Joseph's refusal meant one thing: rejection. And again, as they say, hell hath no fury as a woman scorned. She simply could not accept this defeat and determined to undo Joseph's immorality by accusing him of attempted rape. Verse 16, so she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. And so it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. Now, this was, of course, a false charge. It was she who ought to have been made to answer to her husband for her attempt to seduce Joseph. Joseph's loyalty was to his master, empowered his commitment to the Lord, and ought to have been rewarded and praised. Instead, he's thrown into prison, verse 19. And so it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. One of the questions that students of the Bible have asked over the years is, why didn't Potiphar have Joseph executed? Attempted rape by a slave was easily cause for such punishment. An owner had absolute right to dispose of his slaves any way that he chose, including killing them. As an officer in Pharaoh's elite guard, Potiphar could have easily disposed of Joseph. So why didn't he? Well, probably because he knew the charge was false. But what else could he do? If he ignored his wife's accusation, it would shame and belittle her, and of course drive a wedge between them. He had to pretend to believe her. Potiphar had come to know the character and quality of Joseph, and did the only thing that he could. He put him in prison rather than execute him. Verse 19 says that Potiphar grew angry, but probably not at Joseph. He was likely angry with his wife for manipulating him into a situation where, to save face, he had to dismiss the man who had made his entire household run so well, brought such prosperity. Now, what do you suppose went through Joseph's mind? So this is what resisting temptation gets me? What profit is there in pursuing holiness? I go from chief steward to prisoner? What's lower than being a slave? Well, being a slave in prison. Do you think Joseph was tempted to be bitter? We can be sure he was. Tempted, that is. Just as Mrs. Potiphar tried to wear him down day by day, we may assume that there were other messengers who came to wear him down night by night with the temptation to despair and to give up on God. Something like, what's your commitment to God got you, Joseph? Your commitment to God has put you in the stinking hole. But as he always does, the devil overplayed his hand in his attempt to break Joseph's commitment to God. It was true that Joseph's commitment had landed him in prison, and if being in there was where God wanted him, Joseph didn't want to be anywhere else. Once again, he looked for how he could be useful for the Lord there in prison, and thus we read in verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So it wasn't long until once again, because of divine favor, Joseph rose to the attention of the authorities. They recognized his skill in administration and entrusted the oversight and upkeep of the entire prison to him. Everything he did prospered because God blessed him. Now, I'm sure that there were times that Joseph wondered what was happening, moments when he was tempted to doubt, but he never gave in to them. He'd come to see that while his circumstances quickly changed and changed dramatically, there was one bedrock truth that does not change: the nature and the character of God. In a world that is subject to upheaval, God was the one unchanging certainty, and Joseph held on to him with every ounce of his strength. What you and I can see, because we have the advantage of hindsight, is that all that happened to Joseph was necessary to put him where he needed to be so that he could save many thousands of lives. Joseph had to be in that prison because he needed to meet one of Pharaoh's advisors who was under investigation. That advisor would later recommend Joseph to Pharaoh, and Joseph would end up becoming the prime minister of all of Egypt. But in order to get to that prison, he had to take a tour in Potiphar's house. In order to get to Potiphar's house, he had to be sold by his brothers to a caravan of desert travelers. In order to perform his duties as prime minister of Egypt during a horrendous national crisis, Joseph had to learn administrative skills. And so God sent him to Potiphar to learn economics, the Egyptian system, investing. In overseeing the prison, he learned how to work with difficult people and take care of the needs of many. Here's the lesson for us. Success is not just arriving at the end or the goal. Success is the journey that prepares us to be the people we need to be when we get where we are destined to be. God couldn't just take Joseph from Jacob's tent and stick him on the throne of Egypt. The route to the throne led through the difficult path of adversity so that Joseph could learn and be shaped by his experience to be a good and gracious ruler. Just as Joseph was destined to the throne of Egypt, we are destined for a throne. The Bible tells us that we will rule and reign with Christ one day. As the bride of Christ, we are given the promise and privilege of sitting with him on his throne. Our lives parallel Joseph's as he made his way to the throne of Egypt. Our path is this life, and it lies through the desert of adversity as well as the green fields of plenty. The one thing that will make sure that we make it safely and successfully through is an unshakable commitment to God, one not hampered by circumstances, good or bad, that holds on to God in the day and the night, that sees his purposes above and beyond where we are right now.